There were 100 ways to be humiliated in a royal hall, but Princess Thalisse Dravenmore had discovered the simplest one. Stand perfectly, let them stare. The veil of Dravenmore, black gauze over ivory lace, fell from her hairline to her collarbones and made her an outline instead of a face. Around her, the court decided what must be wrong beneath it. Thalisse of the Veil, someone breathed behind a jeweled fan, the name shaped like a joke they'd told too many times to remember it could still cut. Thalisse kept her chin level. If she lifted it, they would call it pride. If she lowered it, they would call it proof. A silver bell chimed once, clean and cold, and the sound threaded straight through her ribs. Her mother's voice rose from the dais with practiced sweetness. Our daughter has honored the vow made at her first breath. A vow, Thalisse thought, that had been tied around her long before she'd learned how to untie anything. King Aldrin and Queen Myrelle Dravenmore sat above her, crowned and smiling the way people smiled at funerals, like the expression was required, not felt. Until her wedding day, the Queen continued, the veil remains. A hush followed, and inside it lived a ripple of amusement. Soft, controlled, satisfied. Thalisse could almost feel it brush her veil like fingertips. The grand hall smelled of pine resin and cold stone, the same smells she'd breathed since childhood, now sharpened by the copper edge of her own fear. It settled in her chest like a weight she couldn't swallow. Her palms, trapped in satin gloves, grew damp anyway. The veil's lower edge moved against her face, a constant reminder that even air had to pass through a promise. Such devotion, a lord murmured to his companion, not quite quiet enough. Imagine being born into a family that makes vows to hide what they made. His companion gave a thin laugh. At least this one stayed. The others disappeared so fast you'd think the convent doors had teeth. Thalisse didn't turn her head. She didn't have to. She could see them in her mind the way she always did when someone spoke of her sisters. White carriages at dawn, curtains drawn, the absence left behind like a missing limb no one mentioned at dinner. A second whisper drifted, sharper, crueler. Dravenmore only makes daughters, and every one of them, wrong. Her throat tightened, not because she believed it, because some part of her on bad days still tried. The herald struck the floor with his staff. Present the envoys of the South. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. Cold air rolled in first, crisp enough to sting, followed by a scent that didn't belong to Dravenmore's stone and resin world. Cedar smoke, winter wind, and something wild that tugged at the back of Thalisse's mind like a half-remembered song. Then he stepped into view. Alpha King Gryfen Coldwyn. She had seen his likeness on minted coins and embroidered banners. Always stern, always carved into perfection. The man who entered the hall looked less like a symbol and more like weather-made flesh. He moved with quiet certainty, his dark coat clasped at the throat, his presence settling over the room the way a snowfall silenced a forest. Behind him came advisors and guards, eyes forward, footsteps measured. Gryffin's gaze swept the hall once, quick and controlled. Then it found Thalisse, and stopped. The court held its breath as if the hall itself had become a throat. Through the veil's layers, she couldn't see his eyes clearly, but she felt the weight of his attention, steady, not greedy. Not the hungry curiosity of the crowd, not the delight of people waiting to be disgusted. Something careful. He bowed to the dais, deep and formal. King Aldrin, Queen Myrelle. Then he turned toward Thalisse. A fraction of a pause, just enough to be felt. He bowed again, lower than etiquette required for a veiled princess rumored to be a mistake. Bold, someone whispered. Or foolish. Thalisse clasped her hands tighter, then forced her fingers to loosen one by one. Pain was easy. Pain listened. People never did. Her father's voice boomed pleasantly, like a man praising a bargain. Alpha King Gryfen Coldwyn. We thank you for honoring our invitation. Invitation, Thalisse thought, as if he'd come for the view. This union will bind North and South in lasting strength and shared prosperity, King Aldrin continued, the words smooth as polished silver. Relief lived beneath them. Not love, not pride. Relief, Queen Morel lifted a hand toward Thalisse, as if presenting an object with careful handling instructions. Our daughter is obedient, devout, trained in virtue. Trained in silence, Thalisse corrected, her jaw tightening behind the veil. Gryffin's gaze flicked, not to the veil like a challenge, but to her posture, the stillness she used as armor, the small tremor in her shoulder she tried to bury. He spoke at last, voice low and even. Princess Thalisse Dravenmore. Hearing her name from him felt strange but welcome, like a sound she hadn't realized she'd been waiting to hear. Your Majesty, she replied, perfect and practiced. He stepped forward, not close enough to crowd her, close enough that his scent made the air feel different in her lungs. You may keep your vow, Gryfen said. The murmurs sharpened, eager. Of course he would. Of course he'd insist she stay hidden, confirm every cruel story with polite distance. But his next words went another way entirely. And you will keep your dignity, he added. Thalisse's breath caught, surprised by his words. The queen's smile tightened. Dignity is assumed. Gryffin's voice stayed calm, but the air around him shifted, as if the hall remembered what an alpha king was. Not here it isn't. Silence snapped into place, startled, not polite. Thalisse felt heat rise behind her veil, and she hated that it wanted to become tears. The formalities dragged on after that. Dates, vows, ceremonies, sacred traditions spoken by people who didn't have to live inside them. Goblets clinked, quills scratched. The court recovered, because courts always did. They learned how to breathe again while holding on to their cruelty like an heirloom. Then the queen said lightly, as if discussing whether, of course, the veil will be lifted only at the wedding ceremony. That is the promise our bloodline has kept since the first Dravenmore daughter. A noblewoman tittered. How thrilling. Gryffin's gaze sharpened. I have a question. The room leaned toward him. Queen Morel lifted her chin. Ask. Gryffin's voice remained steady. Has anyone in this hall ever heard the vow spoken aloud? A beat. The queen's eyes narrowed. It is not performed. It is honored. Gryfen nodded slowly, as if placing the answer somewhere private. Then I would like to hear it. Now. The hall startled like a flock of birds taking wing. Thalisse's stomach dropped, because that vow was not merely ceremonial. It was magic. It was the kind of promise that didn't care if a court was watching. Her mother's gaze pinned her, a silent blade. Do not embarrass us. But Thalisse's mind did what it always did when she was cornered. It reached for the place where she still owned herself, a narrow alley beyond the palace's outer gate. A child with cracked lips and shaking hands. A figure in ash-gray robes, wrapped head to toe, face hidden, voice altered, leaving bread and medicine and silver where no one would admit to seeing it. The Ashen Magus, the people called him. They bowed to that phantom with reverence. If they'd known it was her, they would have swallowed their respect like poison. I can say it, Thalisse said, before her fear could stop her. Her mother's fingers tightened on the throne's armrest. Gryffin's gaze held steady on Thalisse. Not the veil. Only if you choose. Choose. The word landed like a hand offered in the dark. Thalisse inhaled. The hall quieted with the strange, brittle anticipation of people waiting for a spectacle. Thalisse gave them something else. By breath and blood, by night and name, my face is held in sacred shadow, she said. Until the day of my binding vow, I am unseen and I am unbroken. Let no hand take what time must give. Let no eye claim what truth must offer. As she spoke the final word, an invisible pressure swept through the hall. The braziers flared, then settled. The veil's fabric cooled against her face, as if something ancient had just listened and agreed. Thalisse's breath shook. Across from her, Gryfen exhaled slowly, and for the first time his composure cracked. Just a little. Not fear. Relief. Queen Morel's smile held too tight, as if it might split. The herald cleared his throat, loud enough to pretend he hadn't felt the magic. The date of the wedding ceremony shall be... Thalisse barely heard, because Gryfen stepped nearer, his voice low so only she could hear. Thank you, he murmured. And then, in the same quiet, he added something that made her pulse stumble. Do not remove it before then. Not for anyone. A pause. Not even for me. Talisse's fingers tightened around the edge of her sleeve. Not because she feared him, because the way he said it sounded like someone making a request the universe had already threatened him for. When Gryfen stepped back, the torchlight behind him did something odd. It threw his shadow across the stone. Tall, broad, sharp-edged. And for half a breath, the shadow didn't match his shape. It moved, like it had its own thought. Thalisse's blood chilled. Gryfen's eyes flicked, fast, to the floor, as if he knew she'd seen it. His jaw tightened once. Then the shadow stilled, and the court, oblivious, resumed breathing. Thalisse stood there under her veil, listening to the hall's murmurs return, and realized with sudden clarity, Gryfen Coldwyn hadn't come to Dravenmoor to rescue a kingdom. He'd come because something was hunting him from the inside. And he believed marrying a veiled bride was the only way to keep it from finding the world. By the next dawn, Dravenmoor Castle had already started pretending it had always known how to be kind. The corridors smelled of wax and damp stone, as if the night's chill had seeped into the mortar and refused to leave. Thalisse walked through it with the veil cooling her breath, each exhale pressing the fabric gently against her face. Even her own air came back to her filtered, softened, rearranged, like the castle insisted on editing her into something easier to swallow. Servants hurried past with trunks and folded cloth. Heads bowed too quickly to be respect and too slow to be indifference. Somewhere down the hall, a harp tried to sound cheerful and failed, the notes wobbling like someone smiling with a clenched jaw. Thalisse kept her steps even. If she faltered, the court would call it weakness. If she moved too confidently, they would call it insolence. The safest way to exist here was to be flawless in a way that left no fingerprints. At the end of the corridor, a pair of noblewomen paused just long enough to let their voices drift. "They're leaving this morning," one whispered. "Of course they are," the other replied, soft as silk and just as sharp. "He came for the alliance, not the bride. He probably thinks he's doing charity." Thalisse felt the familiar flare of heat under her ribs. Anger, quick and bright, followed by the steadier thing that always came after. Resolve. Let them think he came for duty, she told herself. Let them think she was a burden. The veil had taught her one truth the court never seemed to learn. What people assumed about her was their weakness, not hers. In her chambers, her maid fastened the last clasp on Thalisse's traveling cloak with hands that trembled, as if the clasp might bite. The woman kept her eyes lowered, as if even looking at Thalisse too long could summon misfortune. The queen arrived without knocking. Queen Morelle Dravenmoor entered like a fragrance, expensive, deliberate, meant to linger after the person was gone. She didn't look at Thalisse's eyes so much as the veil itself, as if confirming it was still there, still doing its job. "Remember," her mother said, smoothing a sleeve that did not need smoothing, "you are saving us." Thalisse's jaw tightened behind the gauze. Saving us. As if she were a rope thrown across ice, something to be grabbed, not thanked. "I remember," Thalisse said. Her mother's smile thinned. "And remember what you are." The words landed with the familiar weight of a hand pushing her shoulders down. Thalisse didn't answer, because answering would require admitting the question had the right to exist. Before the silence could stretch into something worse, the door opened again. A woman stepped in as if doors were suggestions and space was hers by default. She was tall, lean and dressed for movement. Dark riding leathers, a long coat, boots that looked like they'd met mud and won. Her hair was braided tight, her gaze quick and unapologetic. The kind of gaze that didn't ask permission to be direct. "Princess Thalisse Dravenmoor," she said. "Yennefer Crow." The name meant nothing to Thalisse, but the tone did. Not reverent, not mocking, not pitying. Just clear. Like cold water. Yennefer's eyes flicked once to Queen Morelle, taking her in the way someone might assess a locked door, calmly, with the quiet confidence that locks were solvable problems. "I've been assigned to you during the journey," Yennefer continued. "And afterward. Assigned. Queen Morel repeated, as if the word tasted wrong. My daughter has attendants. Yennefer smiled politely. It was the kind of smile that didn't warm anything. It just showed teeth without showing threat. Oh, I'm not here to replace anyone, Yennefer said. I'm here to prevent misunderstandings. And what misunderstandings would those be? The queen asked. Yennefer's smile stayed in place, but her eyes sharpened. The kind where someone says something unkind and later pretends it was a compliment. The South has a hobby of that. Thalisse felt something shift inside her. Small, startled, almost like amusement trying to remember its way home. Queen Morel's nostrils flared. We do not require... Yennefer cut in gently, as if offering a courtesy. You do. You just don't like that you do. Thalisse kept her face still behind the veil, but her heart gave a quiet, surprised thump. Someone had just spoken to the queen like she was a person who could be contradicted. The moment might have stretched into open conflict, if not for the sound of footsteps approaching. Measured, steady, inevitable. The air in the room seemed to change before he even appeared. Like the space itself recognized him and adjusted. Alpha King Gryfen Coldwyn entered without fanfare. He wore a dark traveling coat, his hair tied back, his expression controlled in the way of a man who'd learned that control was sometimes the only form of mercy he could offer. His gaze went to Thalisse first, not to the veil, to her posture, her stillness. The way her hands rested at her sides like she had trained herself never to reach for comfort. He bowed, not for show, not for the court, for her. Princess, he said. Thalisse's throat tightened at the sound of her title spoken like it belonged to a human being and not a bargain. Your Majesty. Gryfen turned to Queen Morel, and his voice became formal without becoming cruel. We depart. The queen's smile returned, bright and brittle. May your path be blessed. Thalisse could feel her mother's attention on the veil like a hand checking a knot. Yennefer stepped subtly closer to Thalisse, not touching her, but present in a way that felt like a shield made of attitude. As they moved through the corridor toward the courtyard, the court followed at a careful distance, like a flock trailing something they didn't understand but wanted to witness. A young lord leaned too close to a companion and whispered, poorly, So that's her. Thalisse of the Veil. Thalisse felt the name like a bruise being pressed. Before Thalisse could decide whether to ignore it, Yennefer slowed just enough to glance back at the young lord. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. If you're going to whisper, Yennefer said pleasantly, commit to it. Half whispers make you look indecisive. And indecisive men always end up marrying someone exactly like their mother. The young lord went red so fast, Thalisse almost worried he might burst into flame from embarrassment alone. His companion choked on a laugh and tried to disguise it as a cough. Thalisse's breath hitched behind the veil. One small, stolen thing that could have been laughter if she'd let it. Yennefer's eyes flicked forward again, satisfied, like a cat that had knocked something off a shelf for moral reasons. The courtyard was cold and bright. Horses stamped and snorted, tack creaked, trunks sat in neat rows. Gryffin's carriage waited, dark wood and heavy curtains, designed for privacy rather than display. A footman opened the door. Gryfen offered his hand. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He simply held it out. Thalisse placed her gloved hand in his palm and stepped up. His hand was steady, and she felt a quiet sense of trust she hadn't expected. Inside the carriage, the world narrowed to a small space of leather and quiet. Yennefer sat across from Thalisse with the easy posture of someone who could nap or win an argument at the same time, depending on what the moment required. A beat later, Gryfen stepped in and the door shut. The carriage rolled forward. And just like that, Dravenmore began to fall away behind them, stone and judgment shrinking into distance. Thalisse stared at the curtain seam as if it could give her answers. Her heart beat hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Gryfen spoke first, voice low. I know this is not what you wanted. The words struck Thalisse more sharply than any insult, because they were an acknowledgement, because they assumed her wants existed. I wanted to be left alone, Thalisse said. Yennefer made a small sound that might have been approval. Gryffin's mouth twitched once, almost a smile. Fair. The carriage settled into the rhythm of travel, wheels humming over packed earth. Outside, trees blurred into a moving wall of gray-green. Minutes passed. Then more. Thalisse felt Gryfen watching her, not as a spectacle, but as if he was measuring something he didn't have language for. Finally, she forced herself to ask softly, "Why did you bow to me?" Gryffin's gaze held hers. "Because you deserved it." Yennefer leaned back with a sigh. "Well, that was annoyingly decent." Gryfen didn't look away from Thalisse. "You will not be mocked in my halls." Thalisse's throat tightened. "You can't control every mouth." "I can control what I allow," he said. The simplicity of it made her chest ache in a place she hadn't let anyone touch in years. Thalisse swallowed, then asked the question that had been burning since the hall. "Even if I am what they say?" She whispered. Gryfen didn't flinch. Even then. Silence filled the carriage, not awkward, just full. Yennefer shifted, as if deciding something. "For the record," she said, tone dry, "if anyone in the South makes a comment about defective bloodlines, I will personally teach them the ancient art of keeping thoughts inside their own head." Thalisse turned slightly toward the window because her eyes had gone hot again, and she refused to give Dravenmore even one tear to gloat over. Outside, the road unfurled through pine forests and low hills. The north was stern and familiar, and it watched her leave like an old ghost that didn't know whether to curse or miss her. A few hours into the journey, the carriage hit a shallow rut. Thalisse jolted and reached instinctively for balance. Gryfen froze. He pulled back carefully, like he'd touched something that might break. Thalisse's pulse jumped. "Your Majesty?" He drew a breath, steadying himself. "Promise me something." Yennefer's eyes opened, alert now. "I don't like that tone," she said, almost conversational. "That tone is always followed by nonsense." Gryfen ignored her, gaze on Thalisse. "No matter what you hear, no matter what anyone suggests." His voice lowered. "Do not lift it early." Thalisse felt the words settle in her bones. Not because they were a command, because they sounded like fear wearing a crown. "Then explain," Thalisse said quietly but firmly. Gryffin's jaw tightened once. "Soon," he said. "You'll understand soon." Yennefer exhaled through her nose. "That's a terrible answer. It's like saying trust me right before someone knocks over a priceless vase." Thalisse didn't laugh, but something in her loosened anyway. Soon. The word followed her for the rest of the road like a shadow that didn't need light. Coldwin Keep didn't rise from the landscape so much as appear in it, like it had always been there and the mountains had simply agreed to make room. Thalisse saw it through the carriage curtains first. Dark stone warmed by lantern light, tall windows glowing against the dusk. It looked strong, but not cruel. There were gardens, even in the cold. Winter herbs protected under glass frames. Narrow paths lit with low lamps. A fountain that ran stubbornly despite the frost. As the carriage approached the gates, the air changed. Not colder, sharper. As if the territory itself had woken up and decided to pay attention. Thalisse's breath caught, and for a moment her skin tingled beneath her clothes, like she'd stepped into water without getting wet. Yennefer noticed immediately. "That feeling?" she murmured. "Ward line." Thalisse's fingers tightened around her cloak. "It recognizes me?" "It recognizes who's invited," Yennefer said. Then, with a quick glance at Thalisse's veil, she added, "And it recognizes who's carrying a promise on her face." The gates opened. The carriage rolled in. Thalisse braced herself for the first laugh, the first hissed comment, the first look of disgust. Instead, the courtyard met her with something calmer. Curious faces held behind discipline, servants moving with purpose, guards standing with respectful stillness. Gryfen stepped down first. Then he turned and offered his hand again. Thalisse took it. He steadied her without pulling, without rushing. It was a small thing. It felt like an entire philosophy. A steward approached, older, white-haired, calm-eyed, hands folded as if he'd learned that panic was a luxury. "Your Majesty," he said to Gryfen, then bowed to Thalisse. "Princess, I am Selwyn Ardain, the keep's steward." Thalisse inclined her head. "Thank you for receiving me." Selwyn's gaze did not linger on the veil. It settled on her posture, her voice, the way she held herself like someone used to being attacked by whispers. Your quarters are prepared. There is no expectation tonight beyond rest. A servant behind him shifted as if itching to stare. Yennefer turned her head slightly, still smiling. If you're going to stare, she said sweetly, at least do it with confidence. Half staring is just indecision, and indecision is the first step toward bad life choices. The servant's eyes snapped forward so fast Thalisse almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Inside the keep, warmth wrapped around Thalisse's skin in layers. Firelight, cedar smoke, the faint smell of bread, and something clean like soap and linen. Her shoulders unclenched a fraction as they walked. The corridors were lit softly. Tapestries lined the walls, wolves under a moon, a mountain crowned in snow, and strangely, a silver veil stitched among stars. Thalisse's throat tightened at the sight. It felt too specific to be coincidence. Gryfen noticed her noticing. Old symbol, he said quietly. Not a joke. Thalisse didn't trust herself to answer, so she nodded once. They reached her chambers, and Thalisse stopped in the doorway. It wasn't the luxury that stunned her. It was the intention. A fire already burning. Curtains thick enough to block cold. A dressing table set with simple pins instead of showy jewels. A tray with tea that smelled of mint and honey. The kind of comfort that didn't require performance. Someone had prepared this as if her comfort mattered. Gryfen stayed near the threshold, not entering, as if space was something he offered rather than took. Yennefer wandered toward the fire and held her hands out with theatrical devotion. Warmth, she sighed. My one true romance. It never disappoints me. Unlike people. People are a hobby I regret. Thalisse's mouth almost lifted under the veil. Almost. Selwyn bowed and withdrew with the servants, leaving the room quieter. Thalisse turned slightly, and her voice came out softer than she meant it to. You said I would understand soon. Gryffin's gaze held hers. The tiredness in his eyes was clearer now, up close, like someone who'd been carrying a secret too long and was running out of places to set it down. You deserve honesty, he said. Thalisse's pulse tightened. Then give it. Gryfen stepped just inside the room, far enough that his voice wouldn't carry into the corridor. There is a curse on the Coldwin line, he said quietly. Not a story. Not superstition. A living thing. Thalisse's skin cooled beneath her cloak, as if her body understood danger before her mind did. Yennefer leaned back in her chair like she was settling in for a play. I'm going to pretend I'm not listening, she announced, because I'm a mature adult with boundaries. She paused. However, if you say anything truly ridiculous, I reserve the right to comment. Gryfen didn't react to her. His focus stayed on Thalisse, steady and careful. It lives in mirrors, he continued. Reflections. Any surface that can hold a face long enough to recognize it. Thalisse swallowed. What does it do? It doesn't tear through halls, Gryfen said, as if choosing each word to avoid giving fear a shape it didn't need. It takes something quieter. His jaw tightened. Joy, stability, the ability to feel safe in your own skin. Thalisse's throat ached. She understood that kind of theft. She'd lived with it for years, even without a curse. It spreads like cold fog, Gryfen said. People become hollow, not dramatic, not obvious. He held Thalisse's gaze as if he needed her to believe him. They stopped laughing. Yennefer made a small, offended sound. That's unacceptable. I run on spite and humor. If something steals laughter, I'm filing a complaint with the universe. Thalisse almost laughed at that. Almost. Then felt the weight of Gryffin's next words before he even spoke them. And the only thing that holds it back, Gryfen said, is a binding vow made in shadow. Thalisse's hand tightened on her cloak. My veil. Gryfen nodded once. Your vow is old. Older than our kingdoms. It was made for a reason even your court has forgotten. Thalisse's chest tightened, sharp. So you married me to keep my people safe, Gryfen said. And the honesty hit like cold water. Thalisse's breath caught. Used. Again. But he didn't let the truth end there. His voice softened, rough around the edges. I will not use you as a shield and call it love. Thalisse went still. I will protect you, he said. I will honor you. And whatever we become will be chosen, not forced by fear. The fire crackled, loud in the silence. Thalisse forced her voice steady. Why can't I lift it early? Gryffin's eyes darkened. Because the curse listens. Thalisse's spine went cold. It is drawn to truth revealed too soon, he said. It twists it. It turns it into hunger. Yennefer sighed like she'd been personally inconvenienced by fate. So basically, this is the worst surprise party in history, and the surprise is emotional damage. Thalisse steadied herself behind the veil. The humor helped. It didn't fix anything, but it gave her somewhere to breathe. Gryffin's gaze lifted to the veil, not as a challenge, not as an object, but as a boundary between her and something he couldn't control. If you lift it before the ceremony, he said quietly, the curse will see what it wants through you. Thalisse's throat tightened. My face. Your self, Gryfen corrected. The part of you they've forced you to hide. The tenderness in the words made Thalisse's chest ache in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. Then why do you look relieved when you're near me? She asked, barely above a whisper. Gryffin's breath caught. Because when you spoke the vow in Dravenmoor, he paused, and for a moment his composure slipped, just enough to show what lived beneath it. It quieted. Thalisse's pulse hammered. Across the room, in the corner, a mirror stood covered in dark cloth. And as if the room itself had heard them, the covered mirror gave a soft, almost inaudible sound. Like a sigh, like something waking up. Thalisse's breath caught. Yennefer's head snapped toward it. Nope, she said, crisp and final. Absolutely not. If that mirror makes one more creepy noise, I'm throwing a blanket over the entire concept of reflections. Gryffin's jaw tightened. It's already listening. Thalisse stood behind her veil, heart pounding, and realized the first cliff edge of her new life wasn't the wedding. It was tonight. Because something in the dark had already noticed her, and it wanted her to do the one thing she'd been commanded never to do. Reveal herself too soon. Thalisse tried to convince herself that dinner was only dinner. A table. Plates. Polite words that tasted like nothing. But as the keep settled into evening, she could feel the shape of the night forming around her like a too-tight collar. The fire in her chambers burned steadily, warm enough to loosen the stiffness in her fingers, yet the veil kept its cool patience against her skin, as if it had its own sense of time and refused to be rushed into comfort. Yennefer hovered near the hearth, watching the flames with the focused devotion of someone who had survived too many winters and now treated warmth as a personal religion. You're thinking too loudly, Yennefer said without turning around. Thalisse's breath caught. I'm not speaking. Yennefer finally looked at her, eyes bright with that particular brand of mischief that always felt like a shield. Exactly. Thalisse crossed to the dressing table. The mirror there was covered in a dark cloth so thick it looked like it could smother sound. Someone had tied it down with a neat knot, as if they didn't trust the fabric not to get curious on its own. She didn't blame them. Thalisse's fingertips paused inches from the cloth. She didn't touch it. She didn't even let herself lean too close. The last thing she wanted was to give the night a reason to notice her. Yennefer watched the hesitation and sighed dramatically. If it makes you feel better, I also avoid things that stare back. Thalisse's voice came out soft. You believe him? Yennefer shrugged one shoulder. I believe he's terrified. Then she added, like it was an afterthought, terrified men make two kinds of choices. Stupid ones, or sincere ones. Thalisse looked down at her gloved hands. The gloves were fine, soft, expensive, perfectly fitted. That should have been comforting. Instead, they reminded her of Dravenmoor, how cruelty could be wrapped in velvet and still leave bruises. And which choice is he making? Thalisse asked. Yennefer's smile didn't show warmth so much as readiness. Ask me after dinner. A knock came at the door, gentle, not timid. A servant's voice followed, careful and neutral. Princess, the table is prepared when you are ready. Thalisse's stomach tightened like it always did before she entered a room full of eyes. Yennefer pushed away from the hearth and adjusted her coat with a crisp tug. All right, she said, as if they were about to walk into a minor inconvenience rather than a social trap lined with silverware. Remember, you don't owe anyone your fear. If they want it, they can earn it the hard way. Thalisse glanced at her. What is the hard way? Yennefer's expression turned thoughtful. Embarrassment, regret, possibly indigestion. Thalisse almost laughed, almost, and that near laughter steadied her more than any prayer had ever managed. They left the chambers together. The corridor outside was warmer than Dravenmoor's had ever been, not just from torches, but from the way the keep seemed to hold heat, like it intended to share it. Cedar smoke curled through the stone air, mixed with the scent of bread and herbs. The smell made Talisse's stomach ache with something that wasn't hunger so much as memory, of stealing loaves in the dark, of leaving them in doorways where small hands would find them at dawn. The Ashen Magus had never attended a formal supper. He would have hated the chairs. As they approached the dining hall, Thalisse heard voices. Low, layered, measured. No roaring laughter. No sharp cracks of ridicule. But beneath the civility, she sensed the same thing she'd always sensed at court, curiosity with teeth. The doors opened. Light spilled out, golden and steady. The hall was smaller than Dravenmoor's grand hall, but it felt more alive. Candles lined the walls. A fire burned at the far end. The table was long, set with polished silver that reflected flame in soft ripples. Talisse's gaze snagged on those reflections. The silver was too bright, too ready. Someone had draped dark cloth over every mirror in sight, but silver was still silver, and Thalisse could feel the faint pull of it in the air, like a thread stretched tight across the room. At the head of the table stood Gryfen. He wore a dark, formal coat that made him look carved out of night and winter. Yet his posture was not stiff with performance. When he saw Thalisse, his focus sharpened, not on the veil, but on her arrival itself, as if her presence in his hall mattered more than the spectacle Dravenmoor had built around her. He stepped forward and bowed. Thalisse. Not princess, not bride, not veiled anything, just her name, offered like a place to stand. Her throat tightened behind the veil. Your Majesty. Gryffin's gaze held hers. You're safe here. Yennefer made a small sound beside her, approval disguised as impatience. Let's all pretend we're not going to cry into the soup, she murmured, then louder. Where do you want her seated? Gryfen didn't look away from Thalisse as he answered. Beside me. A ripple moved through the guests. Small shifts of posture, the careful repositioning of attention. Thalisse felt it like a change in pressure. Gryffin's hand lifted, not reaching for her, not demanding, but indicating the chair at his right. Thalisse walked forward, every step measured. She refused to hurry, refused to shrink. She could feel eyes on her veil, trying to imagine the face they'd decided must be waiting underneath. Let them. She sat. The chair was warm, as if someone had placed it close to the fire on purpose. Yennefer took the seat across from Thalisse, with the relaxed confidence of a woman who treated rooms like puzzles she'd already solved. She looked around the table and smiled politely at everyone, which somehow felt like a warning. Selwyn stood near the wall, hands folded, watchful as stone. The first course arrived, bread still steaming, soup that smelled of rosemary and roasted garlic, small plates of winter fruit. The scents made Thalisse's mouth water despite her nerves. Then the conversation began, as all formal conversations did. Safe topics first. Weather, travel, the keep's gardens, a new litter of wolfhounds in the kennels. Thalisse listened, answered when spoken to, and kept her hands steady on her spoon. For a few minutes it almost felt normal. Almost. Then a woman 2 seats down, pale hair, jeweled collar, smile sharp as a pin, tilted her head and said, Princess, do you eat with the veil on? The words were sweetly phrased. The intent was not. Thalisse's pulse jumped. Heat rose behind her veil, quick and humiliating. Before she could answer, Yennefer set her spoon down with gentle precision. The sound was small and somehow loud. She looked at the woman as if seeing her clearly for the first time. What an interesting question, Yennefer said, voice pleasant. It's the kind of question people ask when they have no personality and need to borrow attention from someone else. A hush fell. Not dramatic, but sharp enough to be felt. The woman's smile faltered. "I beg your pardon?" Yennefer's eyes widened slightly in mock surprise. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did you think you were being subtle?" Thalisse's breath caught. She stared down at her soup, because if she looked up, she might do something reckless like smile. Gryffin's gaze slid to Yennefer for half a beat. The corner of his mouth twitched once, an almost smile, quickly contained. Then he looked back at the pale-haired woman, and the temperature of the room seemed to lower by a degree. "She eats?" Gryfen said calmly. "Like any guest in my hall." The woman lifted her chin. "Of course. I only meant—" "I know what you meant," Gryfen said, voice still even. That was worse than anger. Anger could be argued with. Evenness was final. "And you will not continue." The woman's cheeks colored. She glanced around the table as if searching for support and finding only lowered eyes and careful silence. Yennefer leaned back and added, as if finishing a casual thought, "If you need a hobby, might I suggest embroidery? It's quieter than humiliating yourself in public." Thalisse's shoulders loosened by a fraction she hadn't allowed herself all day. Gryfen turned slightly toward Thalisse, as if the interruption had never mattered. "If you prefer to eat in your chambers tonight, we can end this." Thalisse lifted her chin. The veil shifted softly against her lips. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it held. "I will stay." Gryffin's gaze warmed. Just a little. Good. The meal continued, though the room had changed. The guests spoke more carefully now, their questions filtered through the knowledge that cruelty would be stopped instead of ignored. Thalisse tried to focus on the food. The soup was rich, the bread warm, the herbs bright against the winter air. Still, her attention kept snagging on the silver. Every time a candle flickered, the reflections trembled. And in those tremors, Thalisse felt something like interest. Not in the guests. In her. Gryfen leaned closer, voice low enough that only she would hear. "Are you all right?" Thalisse hesitated, then answered honestly. "The silver." Gryffin's jaw tightened. His gaze flicked, quick, across the table settings. "Keep your eyes on me," he murmured. The request wasn't possessive, it was protective. Thalisse forced herself to do it. She looked at him. Not the veil, not the table, not the shimmering edges of reflections, but Gryffin's face, the steady set of his mouth, the calm in his eyes that looked hard-won. For a moment, her body believed him. The candlelight gilded the line of his cheek. His scent, cedar smoke and winter air, shifted as he moved, subtle and grounding. Then he said quietly, like a vow spoken without ceremony, "I will protect you from everything in this keep, even if I have to protect you from myself." Thalisse's breath caught. "From yourself?" Gryffin's gaze didn't waver. "From what follows me." A small laugh tried to rise in Thalisse's throat, not because it was funny, but because the tenderness of the honesty felt impossible. She swallowed it down, and the motion made the veil brush her lips again. Across the table, Yennefer was watching them with narrowed eyes, like she was both impressed and annoyed by the sincerity. She mouthed something without sound. Finally, Thalisse's fingers tightened around her spoon. She reminded herself that she had survived Dravenmoor by not trusting warmth too quickly. But warmth was here, and it was offering itself without asking her to earn it through suffering. As the final course arrived, spiced pears, honey cakes, tea that smelled faintly of mint, one of the younger servants hurried in, flustered and pale. Selwyn stepped forward, quiet and immediate. "What is it?" The servant swallowed. A guest requested a looking glass. For her hair." The room went still. Thalisse felt her skin prickle beneath her sleeves. Gryffin's posture tightened, a controlled stillness that signaled danger without needing to shout. "No mirrors," he said, voice calm and absolute. "Not tonight." The servant nodded quickly and backed away, relief flooding his face as if he'd been waiting for permission to refuse. But the damage was already done. Because on the polished surface of Thalisse's spoon, the candlelight gathered. Bright, liquid, too aware. And in that bright curve, Thalisse saw something that made her blood run cold. Not her own reflection. Gryffin's. Except the reflection's mouth curved upward in a smile Gryfen was not wearing. The false smile widened by a fraction, and in the smallest bend of silver, a whisper seemed to form without sound. An old hungry familiarity wrapped in a name that wasn't hers, not really, but had been used to cage her for years. Thalisse of the Veil. Thalisse's breath caught behind the veil. Her fingers went numb around the spoon. And beside her, Gryffin's hand, warm and steady, covered hers on the table, firm without force, as if he'd felt the moment happen and refused to let her face it alone. "Don't look," he murmured. But it was too late. Something had already looked back. For half a breath, Thalisse forgot how to swallow. The spoon sat in her hand like a small, harmless thing. Polished silver, warmed by soup and candles. The kind of object nobody would fear, until it decided to become a doorway. In its curve, the candlelight gathered and trembled, and Gryffin's reflection smiled. Not his real mouth. Not the steady line she'd been watching. A different smile. Thin, knowing, practiced. A smile that belonged to something that had never once needed to ask permission. Thalisse's fingers went numb around the handle. Her body reacted first. A cold rush along her spine, a tightening in her lungs. A pulse in her throat so loud, she felt certain the entire table could hear it. Beside her, Gryfen gently placed his hand over hers on the table, a quiet gesture of support. "Don't look," he murmured. But she had already looked. The seeing had already happened. It had reached her the way a whispered insult reached. Quietly, precisely, aimed for the place that still bruised. Thalisse of the Veil. The name slid through her without sound, as if it didn't need a voice to be heard. Her stomach turned, sharp and hollow. Across the table, Yennefer's chair scraped back an inch, small, controlled. Her gaze wasn't on the guests anymore. It was on the silver, on the candlelight, on the air itself, like she expected it to grow teeth. Gryfen didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Selwyn," he said, and the steward moved instantly, as if the name had been a bell. "Yes, Your Majesty." "End the meal." A ripple of confusion moved through the guests. A few mouths opened, ready to shape polite protests. Yennefer beat them to it with a bright, effortless smile. "Well, that was delightful. I especially enjoyed the part where everyone learned that curiosity is not, in fact, a personality." One of the guests blinked, mid-breath, like they weren't sure if they'd been insulted. Yennefer continued in the same pleasant tone, as if discussing desserts. "Good night. Please don't trip over your own opinions on the way out." Chairs shifted. Fabric rustled. Good night scattered like dropped coins. Thalisse stayed seated until Gryfen's hand lifted slightly, guiding her up with nothing more than warmth and timing. The room blurred at the edges as she stood, the candlelight too bright, the silver too eager to catch it. She kept her eyes on Gryffin's shoulder as they moved. His presence, calm and steady, helped ease her panic. The heat of his presence did not erase fear, but it gave her something solid inside it. Yennefer fell into step on Thalisse's other side, close enough that Thalisse could hear her quiet exhale. "You're doing great," Yennefer said under her breath, like she was annoyed that sincerity existed but willing to tolerate it for the moment. "If you pass out, aim for something expensive. Make it everyone's problem." Thalisse's breath hitched, half laugh, half shock. It didn't become a full laugh, but it cracked something open. Enough air to keep going. They left the dining hall and moved into the corridor where the light softened and the air smelled of cedar and linen instead of candle wax and polished metal. Thalisse's pulse was still too fast, but her feet kept finding the floor. Gryfen didn't look back. He didn't need to. His hand stayed near hers, not holding. Simply there, ready. "Where are we going?" Thalisse asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "Somewhere without shine," Gryfen replied. Yennefer made a sound of approval. Finally, a sensible architectural preference. They turned down a narrower passage. The keep changed here. Older stone, thicker walls, torches set lower. The air cooled against Thalisse's cheeks. It smelled faintly of dried herbs, like someone had burned rosemary and left the memory in the mortar. Gryfen stopped before a door reinforced with dark wood and iron bands. There was no mirror on it, no polished handle. Even the metal looked dulled on purpose, like it had been sanded down until it refused to reflect anything at all. Selwyn appeared as if he'd been waiting in the walls. He held out a key without a word. Gryfen took it, unlocked the door, and guided Thalisse inside. The room beyond was simple. A small fire, rough woven rugs, shelves of books, and, most importantly, no gleaming surfaces. The glass of the windows had been treated so it drank light instead of bouncing it back. A place built for someone who understood that reflections were not always harmless. Thalisse's shoulders trembled once now that she had somewhere private to do it. Gryfen closed the door behind them and stood still, as if he didn't want his movement to startle her. Yennefer walked a slow circle of the room, scanning like a bored predator. No mirrors, no polished silver, no decorative nonsense. This room is aggressively practical. Gryfen's eyes flicked to her. That's the point. Yennefer lifted her brows. I approve. It's like the room itself is saying, no, absolutely not. Try again later. Thalisse pressed her gloved hand to her stomach, breathing slowly until the copper taste eased. It spoke, Thalisse whispered. Gryfen's gaze sharpened. What did it say? Thalisse hesitated. Saying it aloud felt like giving it permission to exist in the room. Yennefer, mercifully, didn't push. She only leaned against a shelf and crossed her arms, like she would personally wrestle the air if it tried something. Thalisse swallowed. It used the name they use. Gryfen's jaw tightened. You are not that name. The certainty in his voice struck Thalisse in the ribs. Not as comfort, as something more dangerous. Belief. It wants you to be small. Gryfen continued quietly. Because it can't feed on what stands. Thalisse's throat tightened behind the veil. It smiled with your mouth. A shadow passed through Gryfen's eyes. Quick, controlled, gone. It mimics, he said. It performs. It tries to lure you into thinking it's safe. Yennefer straightened. So it's a parasite with excellent acting skills. Gryfen's gaze held steady. Yes. Yennefer sighed like she'd been personally inconvenienced by the concept of evil having charisma. Of course it is. Silence settled. Not empty. Full of fire crackle, slow breathing, and the quiet awareness that something outside this room could see through anything that shone. Thalisse finally looked up at Gryfen. He was watching her like he was making a choice in real time. Choosing calm instead of fear, choosing her steadiness over his panic. You asked me to promise, Thalisse said, that I wouldn't lift it early. Gryfen's hand flexed at his side, as if he'd once reached for something and learned not to. Yes, Thalisse's voice steadied. I will keep my vow. Relief moved across his face so subtly that she almost missed it. But her body didn't miss it. Her body felt the shift the way it felt the difference between a locked door and an open one. Then she added, because she could not live inside half-truths again. Not here, not now. But I won't be kept in the dark. Gryfen's gaze didn't drop. You shouldn't be. Yennefer nodded once, sharp. Good. We're all in agreement. Secrets are overrated. They give people wrinkles. Gryfen's mouth twitched, almost a smile, quickly restrained. He drew a breath. There's something you need to understand about the veil. Thalisse held still. It isn't only hiding you, Gryfen said. It's anchoring you. The words landed like a stone in her chest. Yennefer's eyes narrowed. Anchoring. Like a ship? Like a soul. Gryfen corrected quietly. Thalisse's fingers tightened in her gloves. The firelight wavered. She forced herself to breathe through the veil's cool touch, to stay in her own body. Gryfen's gaze stayed on her eyes. You spoke the vow. It answered you. That means you are bound to it more deeply than anyone in Dravenmore ever admitted. Thalisse's throat ached. So I was promised before I was born. Yes, Gryfen said, and his honesty was a kind of gentleness. And I'm sorry. The apology struck harder than she expected. Thalisse looked down, because she didn't trust her eyes. For a moment, she was 12 again, standing in a corridor outside the Queen's chamber, hearing laughter and learning that love had rules, and she was not the kind of daughter who got to change them. Yennefer's voice cut softly into the moment, sardonic but careful. If it helps, Princess, I was also promised to something at birth. Thalisse blinked and looked up. Yennefer's expression was dead serious. A lifetime of witnessing foolishness. A small, real sound escaped Thalisse, half laugh, half release. Yennefer nodded, satisfied. There it is. Gryfen's gaze warmed, just slightly. Thalisse steadied herself on that sliver of warmth and asked the question that had been waiting like a blade behind her ribs. What happens if it convinces me to lift it? Gryfen's face went very still. Then it will see you clearly. Thalisse swallowed. And? Gryfen's voice lowered. And it will try to claim what the vow protects. The room felt colder. Yennefer straightened fully now. Okay, that's enough ominous for one evening. I'm going to stay outside your door, Princess. If anything whispers your name through a spoon again, I'll personally ban cutlery. Talisse's breath caught. You don't have to. Yennefer waved a hand. Yes, I do. I'm invested now. I like your spine. It's refreshing. She moved to the door, then paused and looked at Gryfen with a pointed expression. And you, Your Majesty, no more soon. If you say soon one more time, I'll start throwing dictionaries. Gryfen's gaze flicked to her, dry. Noted. Yennefer left, and the door shut softly behind her. Thalisse and Gryfen stood alone in the room without shine. The quiet between them changed. It wasn't the quiet of fear now. It was the quiet of two people who had seen the edge of something and decided not to step over it. Gryfen's voice dropped, careful. I meant what I said at dinner. Talisse's pulse tightened. Which part? All of it, he replied. I will protect you. Here, in my halls, in your vow. He hesitated, then added, as if he needed her to hear this most of all. And I will never ask you to break what keeps you safe, not even if I want to see you. Talisse's breath caught behind the veil. Want. He had said it like a truth, not a demand. She didn't move. She didn't lift her hands. But she felt the moment settle into her bones like a new kind of promise, one that had been chosen, not imposed. Outside the room, far down the corridor, a torch flickered. And for a heartbeat, Thalisse could swear she heard something soft and pleased slide along the keep's stone like a fingertip. Waiting. Thalisse slept in pieces. Not the kind of sleep that restored. The kind that happened in small surrenders. 10 minutes of darkness, then wakefulness, then another 10 minutes. Each time she surfaced, she expected to hear her name whispered from a polished surface that shouldn't have a voice. But when morning came, it arrived quietly. A gray light pressed at the windows. The fire had burned low, leaving the room smelling of ash and cedar. Thalisse lay still for a moment, listening to her own breathing through the veil. She rose and dressed without calling for help, more out of habit than pride. In Dravenmoor, needing anything had always been treated like a flaw. When she opened the door, Yennefer was already there, sitting in a chair in the corridor like she'd been carved into it overnight. A cup of tea steamed in her hands. She looked up. Good morning? Nothing tried to murder your spirit through a spoon, so I'd call the night a success. Thalisse blinked. You stayed here all night. Yennefer shrugged. I took a nap. I woke up once to glare at a candle. It behaved after that. Thalisse felt warmth rise in her chest that had nothing to do with fire. Thank you. Yennefer made a face like gratitude was a foreign language. Don't get sentimental. It's bad for my brand. They walked together toward Talisse's chambers. Her actual chambers. The ones with comfort arranged like someone meant it. The corridor smelled faintly of bread now, and the keep's servants moved with quiet purpose. They bowed to Thalisse with a respect that didn't feel forced, and it made her ribs ache in a strange way. In her sitting room, breakfast waited. Warm rolls, honey, fruit, tea that smelled of mint and something floral. There was also a note on thick paper, written in a steady hand. Thalisse, eat, then meet me in the library. No mirrors there. Gryfen. Thalisse stared at the note longer than she needed to. Yennefer leaned over her shoulder. He writes like someone who doesn't waste words. Thalisse folded the note carefully. So do you. Yennefer's mouth twitched. Flattery. Interesting. Risky. Thalisse took a bite of bread. It was warm enough to soften the tightness in her stomach, sweet enough to remind her that food could be comfort rather than punishment. Then she followed Gryffin's instructions. The library sat in the older part of the keep, past corridors where the stone felt thicker and the air smelled of ink and leather bindings. As promised, there were no mirrors. Even the glass lanterns were frosted, refusing to offer clear reflections. Gryfen waited inside near a long table, sleeves rolled slightly as if he'd been awake for hours. He looked up when Thalisse entered, and his gaze softened in that small, controlled way that felt like a private signal meant only for her. "Thalisse," he said. Yennefer dropped into a chair and immediately began inspecting the room like she expected it to disappoint her. No mirrors. Love that. 10 out of 10. Would recommend. Gryffin's mouth twitched. "Good morning, Yennefer." Yennefer nodded. "Good morning. Don't say soon." Thalisse almost smiled under the veil. Gryfen gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Thalisse sat. On the table lay an old book, its cover worn, the edges softened by time. The symbol on it was stitched in thread that had faded to the color of moonlight. A veil, stars, and a thin line that looked like a closed eye. Thalisse's throat tightened. "What is that?" Gryfen rested his hand on the book. Not possessive, just steady. "A record." Yennefer leaned forward. "A record like history? Or a record like the time I fell down the stairs in front of everyone?" Gryfen didn't look away from Thalisse. "History." Yennefer sat back. "Boring. Proceed." Gryfen opened the book. Inside were pages of careful script and diagrams, circles, lines, a veil shape repeated again and again like a prayer drawn instead of spoken. "The veil vow isn't a Dravenmoor tradition," Gryfen said quietly. "It predates the Dravenmoors. They inherited it. And then they used it." Thalisse's fingers tightened on her lap. "Used it." The word hit too close to home. Gryfen continued, voice low and even. "It was created as a binding, an agreement between a person and a law older than our kingdoms." Thalisse's breath caught. "A law." Gryfen nodded. "The law of the unseen bride." Yennefer blinked. "That is dramatic." Gryffin's gaze flicked to her. "It's accurate." Yennefer lifted her cup. "Fine. Carry on." Gryfen looked back at Thalisse. "The law requires a vow of concealment freely spoken, even if the circumstances aren't free. The vow creates a pocket of shadow, an anchor point where certain things cannot look directly." Thalisse's pulse jumped. "The curse." "Yes," Gryfen said. "It cannot claim what cannot be fully seen before the binding day." Thalisse's mouth went dry behind the veil. "So the day of the ceremony," Gryfen said, "is the day the law completes." Yennefer's tone turned sharp. "Meaning?" Gryffin's gaze stayed steady. "Meaning the veil comes off, and the curse loses its excuse to linger. It either breaks, or it reveals itself fully." Thalisse's skin prickled. She forced her voice steady. "And if it reveals itself fully?" Gryfen hesitated. Only a breath. Then answered honestly. "Then we face it with the law complete. No gore, no dramatic threats. Just the calm truth of someone who had been living with an invisible predator and had finally decided to stop pretending it wasn't there." Thalisse breathed through the veil's cool touch, letting it anchor her back into her own body. "You said my vow has to be freely spoken." Gryffin's gaze tightened, like he'd expected the question and dreaded it. "Yes." Thalisse's throat ached. "I spoke it in the hall because you asked." "I asked," Gryfen said quietly. "But you chose." Thalisse stared at him, and for a moment she didn't know what to do with the idea that her choice mattered, that her voice could change the shape of her fate. Yennefer made a small, thoughtful sound. "Well," she said, "that's inconveniently meaningful." Gryffin's eyes flicked to Yennefer. "You're allowed to be meaningful too." Yennefer looked personally offended. "No, I'm not." Thalisse's breath escaped in a small laugh this time. Real, quick, startled. The sound surprised her as much as it did Gryfen. Gryfen's gaze warmed. Good. Thalysse's cheeks heated behind the veil, and she hated that she liked the way his eyes softened when she laughed. Hated it, because liking it felt like opening a door. And yet, Gryfen turned a page. There's something else. Thalysse's pulse tightened again. Gryfen's voice lowered. The law recognizes not only the vow, but the person who carries it. It marks them. Thalisse froze. Marks them how? Gryfen lifted his hand slowly, palm up, as if offering her the chance to refuse. I can show you, he said, but only if you want. The gentleness of the permission made her breath catch. Thalisse stared at his open hand. Her instincts, trained by years of being handled like an object, told her to keep distance. But another part of her, quieter and newly stubborn, wanted to know the truth of her own body. Thalisse placed her gloved hand in his palm. His fingers closed lightly around hers, a calm, steady gesture. Then she felt a strange but gentle warmth, as if the old magic recognized his touch, like the vow recognized contact and responded with a quiet, living awareness. Talisse's breath caught. Gryfen's eyes flicked down to their hands. His jaw tightened once, as if he felt it too. Yennefer leaned forward, eyes narrowed. If your magical law starts flirting, I'm leaving. Talisse's heart stumbled at the word. Flirting. Gryfen released Talisse's hand gently, as if he didn't trust himself not to hold on too long. The law is awake, he said quietly. That's what that means. Thalisse swallowed. And the curse? Gryfen's gaze lifted to hers. It noticed last night. It will try again. Talisse's fingers curled in her lap. She thought of the spoon, the false smile, the whisper, the way it had used the cruel name like a hook. Then, unexpectedly, another thought rose. One she hadn't invited. The Ashen Magus. The poor quarters beyond Coldwyn's walls, the small hands, the quiet hunger she'd learned to read in a single glance. The way need pulled at her like gravity. Her chest tightened. Yennefer watched her face, what she could see of it through the veil, and frowned slightly. Don't, Yennefer said, as if she could hear Talisse's thoughts forming. Talisse's pulse jumped. Don't what? Yennefer's eyes narrowed. Don't get that look. What look? The look that says, I'm about to do something noble and stupid. Yennefer lifted her cup like it was a judge's gavel. I know that look. It's contagious. Talisse's throat tightened. She looked away, toward the shelves, toward the old spines, toward anything but Yennefer's uncanny perception. Gryfen's gaze sharpened. What is it? Thalisse hesitated. Then, because she was tired of being a person whose truths were always hidden, she said quietly, There are people outside these walls who need help. Gryfen held her gaze. Yes. Talisse's pulse steadied. I used to... She stopped. The words were a door she hadn't planned to open today. Yennefer's voice turned deceptively light. You used to what, princess? Thalisse looked down at her hands. Never mind. Yennefer leaned in, smile sweet as a trap. Oh no, absolutely mind. If you have a secret identity, I need to know. It affects my schedule. Talisse's heart thudded. Gryfen's gaze remained calm, but his attention sharpened like a blade being drawn slowly. Thalisse? He said quietly. Tell me. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. Talisse's fingers curled. Then she whispered, They call him the Ashen Magus. Yennefer went still. Gryfen didn't move, but something in his eyes shifted. Recognition, surprise, and then a slow, dawning understanding. Talisse's throat tightened. It was the only time I could breathe. Yennefer stared at her for a long beat, then set her cup down carefully. Finally, she said, with the seriousness of someone making a vow of her own, You realize I'm going to need details. Talisse's pulse hammered. Gryfen's voice was low. You've been leaving the castle? Talisse's breath caught. She didn't answer fast enough. Yennefer's eyes narrowed with sudden satisfaction. Oh, she said softly. Oh, you absolutely have. Talisse's heart lurched, and Gryfen, very still, asked the question that made the air in the room feel thinner. When was the last time you did it? Talisse's fingers tightened in her lap as the library's candlelight trembled. soft, steady, and far too eager to be trusted. "Last week," she whispered. Gryffin's expression grew more thoughtful, and in the quiet that followed, Thalisse realized she had just stepped onto a new edge, one where Gryffin's secret and hers were about to collide. Because outside the keep, the world still needed the Ashen Magus, and inside the keep, the curse loved anything that tried to hide in plain sight. Thalisse waited until the keep exhaled. There was a sound to a castle at night, soft footfalls fading, distant doors settling into their frames, the last murmurs of servants dissolving into quiet. When it finally came, it was less silence than permission. In her chambers, the fire burned low, and the covered mirror sat in the corner like a problem pretending to be furniture. Thalisse didn't look at it. She didn't look at anything that might look back. She moved instead to the trunk at the foot of her bed and lifted the lid as if she were opening a confession. The ash-gray robes were folded neatly inside. Heavy cloth. Matte thread. No shimmer, no decorative clasp, no polished anything. The hood was deep enough to swallow a face, and the wrappings for her hands were soft and tight, designed to leave no skin exposed. She had made the outfit years ago with shaking fingers, in a cold room that had never once felt like hers. She'd chosen the cloth carefully, not for beauty, but for invisibility. A covering that made her into something the poor could trust. The Ashen Magus, a phantom with bread in his sleeves and coins in his pocket. Thalisse's chest tightened as she slid the robes over her clothes. The cloth smelled faintly of smoke and dried herbs, like it remembered every night she'd stepped out of Dravenmore and pretended she belonged to no one. She tied the hood, then wrapped her face beneath a layer of dark gauze, separate from the veil, rougher, more practical. The veil stayed where it always stayed. The veil was a vow. This was simply a disguise. When she finished, she was no longer a princess. She was a shadow with purpose. A soft knock came at the door. Thalisse froze. Then Yennefer's voice floated through, too calm to be innocent. "If you're doing something stupid and noble, I'd like to be invited. I hate being left out of disasters." Thalisse closed her eyes. "Of course." She opened the door slowly. Yennefer stood there fully dressed, hair braided, arms folded, expression bright with vindication. Her gaze flicked over Thalisse's robes from head to toe. Then she nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion she'd had since birth. "I knew it." Thalisse tried for dignity. Dignity, in her experience, required lying. "You're imagining things." Yennefer stepped past her into the room like the concept of boundaries had never impressed her. She pointed at the ash-gray robe. "You're wearing a whole dramatic outfit. That's not imagination. That's evidence." Thalisse shut the door softly. "You shouldn't be here." Yennefer turned, eyebrows lifting. "That's what I said to fate when it handed me a life full of foolish people. And yet, here we both are." Thalisse's throat tightened. "Yennefer." Yennefer lifted a hand. "No, don't do the thing where you try to protect me from your own kindness. It's insulting and also not going to work." Thalisse hesitated, then let out the truth like a breath she'd been holding too long. "People outside the keep are hungry." Yennefer's expression didn't soften. It sharpened. "Yes." Thalisse stared at her. "You already knew?" Yennefer shrugged. "I have eyes, and ears, and a deep personal commitment to noticing what everyone else ignores." Then she added, dry as dust, "It's my least favorite hobby." Thalisse's hands tightened in her sleeves. "I used to help in Dravenmore because no one else would. I can't stop because I'm here now." Yennefer studied her for a long moment, gaze sliding to the covered mirror and back, as if measuring risk against principle. Finally, she sighed. "All right. If you insist on being a midnight legend, I'm coming with you." Thalisse blinked. "No." Yennefer's mouth quirked. "Yes." "You can't." "I can," Yennefer interrupted. "And I will. Because if something tries to whisper you into doing something reckless, I'd like to be present to insult it." Thalisse's chest tightened with a reluctant warmth. "You don't even know me." Yennefer snorted. "I know enough. You have a spine. You have guilt. And you're the kind of person who would rather freeze than admit you're cold. That's basically a personality profile." Thalisse didn't have time to argue, not with the night waiting like a stretched string. They moved through service corridors instead of the main halls. Yennefer led with the confidence of someone who had already mapped every shortcut out of habit. The stone underfoot cooled through Thalisse's boots, and the torchlight leaned orange against the walls, careful not to flare too bright. Still, Thalisse felt the keep watching. Not the people. The place. As they neared a small side door near the kitchens, Yennefer paused. 2 servants stood nearby, whispering over a basket of linens. "Heard him end the meal," one said. "And the princess?" the other asked. A pause, then a softer voice. "They say she's cursed. Dravenmore always is." Thalisse's stomach tightened. Yennefer leaned in toward the servants, smiling brightly. "Hello," she said, loud enough to make them jump. "Just a friendly reminder that if you're going to tell stories, you should pick ones that don't make you sound ignorant." One servant went pale. The other stammered something that might have been an apology. Yennefer waved a hand. "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to your brain for not using it." She walked on, unbothered, and Thalisse followed with her heart hammering. Outside, the night air hit Thalisse's lungs like cold water. It smelled of snow-ready clouds and wood smoke, with a hint of bread drifting from the kitchens. The stars were sharp, bright enough to make the world feel both vast and too exposed. Thalisse pulled the ash hood lower. Yennefer adjusted her own cloak, then looked at Thalisse sideways. "Where do you go?" Thalisse pointed toward the lower streets beyond the keep's inner walls, where lanterns glowed dimmer and roofs dipped closer together. "There." Yennefer exhaled. "Of course it's there. Misery always has excellent real estate." They walked. As they descended, the stones underfoot changed, from smooth, carefully kept paths to rougher cobbles that held dampness in their cracks. In those damp patches, candlelight from distant windows began to gather in thin, treacherous lines. Reflections. Thalisse avoided them instinctively, stepping around every shining sliver as if it were a snare. Yennefer noticed. "You're walking like the ground is insulting you." "The ground is untrustworthy," Thalisse murmured. Yennefer nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Fair." In the poorer quarter, the night smelled different. More smoke, less perfume, less polish, more living. A baby cried somewhere behind a door. A dog barked once, then quieted. A man coughed in a way that sounded like his lungs were tired of their job. Thalisse's chest tightened, familiar and sharp. This was why she couldn't stop. She slipped a small loaf and a wrapped bundle of dried herbs onto a windowsill, where she knew a widow lived. She left coins beneath a loose stone by the baker's back step. She tucked a vial of honeyed syrup into a crate near the apothecary's door with a note written in a careful plain hand. "For the child with the night cough." Yennefer watched, silent for once. Then, as Thalisse set down another bundle, Yennefer muttered, "I can't believe I'm an accomplice to philanthropy." Thalisse's breath hitched. "You could go back." Yennefer's eyes narrowed. "And miss this? I haven't been this entertained since I watched a nobleman try to flirt by quoting poetry he clearly didn't understand." Thalisse turned her head slightly. "You're entertained?" Yennefer shrugged. "Not by suffering. By you. You're the first person I've met in this keep who does something decent without announcing it like a performance." Thalisse's throat tightened behind the wrappings. They rounded a corner and Thalisse paused. A puddle spread across the cobbles, dark as ink, holding the lantern light in its surface. The reflection wasn't strong, just enough to be dangerous. Thalisse's breath caught. She tried to step around it, but the night felt suddenly attentive. A whisper slid up from the water without sound, more thought than voice. "Thalisse of the Veil." Thalisse's stomach turned. Her hands went cold inside her sleeves. In the puddle's surface, a pale oval began to form, suggesting a face, promising clarity, offering the oldest lure in the world. "Look. Just look. See what they've said you are." Yennefer's hand snapped out and grabbed Thalisse's sleeve. "Nope," she said, sharp and calm. "Absolutely not. We're not doing puddle pep talks." Thalisse couldn't speak. The pull was subtle and sickeningly persuasive, like the feeling of leaning too close to an edge and wanting to know what falling would feel like. Then a shadow moved behind them. Footsteps. Measured. Steady. Thalysse's heart lurched. She turned, just enough to see him. Gryfen stood at the mouth of the alley, coat dark, eyes catching the lantern light. His gaze went first to Thalysse's ash-gray robes, then to the puddle, then back to her. For one breath, he looked like a man who had found the truth he hadn't been allowed to ask for. Yennefer groaned softly, as if the universe had personally inconvenienced her. "Of course," she muttered. "Of course," he followed. Gryfen's voice was low, controlled. "Magus." Thalisse went still. He wasn't looking at her veil. He couldn't. The disguise hid her. The vow hid her deeper. But his attention landed on her like recognition anyway. He stepped closer, careful not to angle himself into the puddle's line of sight. Then he took off his cloak and, with one swift movement, dropped it over the water. The reflection vanished. The pull snapped. Thalysse's lungs filled with air again as if she'd been underwater. Gryfen's gaze lifted to her. "Are you hurt?" Talisse's throat tightened. "No." Yennefer crossed her arms. "She's fine." The puddle was being dramatic. Gryfen's eyes flicked to Yennefer. "You brought her here." Yennefer's smile turned sweet. "No, Your Majesty. She brought herself. I simply refused to let her do it alone." Gryfen's jaw tightened once, then loosened. His gaze returned to Thalisse, and his voice softened just enough to feel private. "You shouldn't be here at night." Talisse's hands curled. "Neither should you." A pause. Then quietly, Gryfen said, "I couldn't stay inside knowing it had noticed you." Talisse's pulse stumbled. Yennefer made a sound like she'd bitten into something sour. "Well, that's very earnest. I hate that I'm approving of it." Gryfen didn't smile. He only stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Come back. Now. Before it tries again." Thalisse hesitated, just long enough for the knight to lean in. Then she nodded, and as they turned toward the keep, Thalisse felt it. Not a whisper this time. A presence. Like something unseen had shifted its attention from the puddle to her. Learning. Waiting. The keep looked different when Thalisse returned through a side door with ash-gray sleeves and a heart still racing. In daylight, castles were stone and banners and routine. At night, they were memory. Every corridor held echoes. Every torch cast shadows that could be innocent or not. The air smelled of smoke and wax and the faint soap-clean scent of linens. Comfort layered over vigilance. Yennefer walked ahead as if she owned the hallway, which was impressive considering she was technically escorting a princess in a disguise that would cause several people to faint from scandal alone. Gryfen stayed close to Talisse's side, not touching, but present. His nearness felt like a barrier the knight had to consider. They reached the small room without Shine, the one Gryfen had taken her to before. This time he didn't wait for Selwyn. He unlocked it himself and guided Thalisse inside with a quiet urgency that never became panic. The door shut. For a moment, the three of them simply stood, breathing. Yennefer broke the silence first, because silence was clearly offensive to her. "All right," she said briskly. "Everyone alive? Everyone still in possession of their dignity? Wonderful. Now we can discuss the part where you," she pointed at Thalisse, "are apparently a folk legend, and you," she pointed at Gryfen, "are apparently a king who follows mysterious robed strangers into alleys." Gryfen's gaze flicked to her, dry. "I didn't follow a stranger." Yennefer blinked. "Oh, that's worse." Talisse's throat tightened behind the wrappings. She reached up and loosened the ash gauze from her face, leaving the veil still in place beneath. The familiar fabric rested against her face again, cool, grounding. Gryfen watched her hands as if the act of removing a disguise without removing the vow required reverence. Finally, Thalisse whispered, "You knew." Gryfen's eyes stayed on hers. "I suspected." Yennefer leaned against a shelf. "Of course he did. He's got that quietly observant and emotionally burdened look. Men like that always know too much." Talisse's hands trembled once as she set the ash wrapping aside. "I didn't do it to embarrass you." Gryfen's voice was steady. "You didn't embarrass me." Talisse's chest tightened. "Then why are you—" She couldn't find the word. "Angry? Afraid? Hurt?" Gryfen answered the thing beneath the question. "Because it almost took you." The air felt colder. Yennefer's expression sobered for the first time since Thalisse had met her. "The puddle thing," she said quietly. "That was the curse." Gryfen nodded once. Thalisse's throat tightened. It used the name again. Gryffin's jaw tightened. "It will keep using whatever hurts most." Yennefer lifted a finger. "Then we should all agree, right now, that if anything calls you Thalisse of the Veil, we're going to respond by being extremely unimpressed." Thalisse's breath hitched. "Unimpressed?" Yennefer nodded solemnly. "Yes, like, that's the best you can do? I've heard worse insults from a bored goose." Despite herself, Thalisse felt a small laugh press against the back of her throat. Gryffin's gaze warmed, just a fraction, then hardened again as he looked toward the room's window. Not the glass, the darkness beyond it. "It noticed you in the street," Gryfen said. "That means it will try here too." Thalisse's stomach tightened. "But there are no mirrors in this room." Gryffin's voice went lower. "It doesn't only use mirrors. It uses any surface that can hold a face long enough to recognize it." Yennefer's eyes narrowed. "So, spoons, puddles, possibly shiny buttons." Gryfen didn't deny it. Thalisse suddenly thought of her own clothing, the small metal hook at her cloak, the polished edge of a teacup, the silver thread on a tapestry. The keep was full of little, harmless gleams. A knock came at the door. All three of them went still. Selwyn's voice followed, calm as ever. "Your Majesty, a servant reported that one of the guest rooms is missing a looking glass. It appears someone attempted to carry it into the corridor before being stopped." Thalisse's stomach dropped. Yennefer hissed softly. "Who is trying to walk around with a looking glass at night? That's not a hobby. That's a cry for attention." Gryffin's voice stayed controlled. "Keep it covered. Lock it away. No exceptions." "Yes, Your Majesty." The footsteps retreated. The silence that followed felt too deliberate, like the keep itself was holding its breath. Thalisse's skin prickled beneath her sleeves. Then the fire in the hearth did something strange. Not a flare. A lean. The flame bent as if listening toward the corner of the room where a simple metal pitcher sat on a table. Dull, ordinary, meant for water. Its surface wasn't polished, but it was curved. And in its curve, candlelight gathered anyway. Thalisse's breath caught. A whisper slid through the room without sound, as intimate as a thought you didn't choose. "Show them." Thalisse's hands went cold. Yennefer moved first, stepping between Thalisse and the table. "No," Yennefer said flatly, to the air itself. "We're not doing this." The whisper shifted, smooth as silk. "He wants to see you." Thalisse's pulse stumbled. It was cruelly clever, taking a truth and twisting it into a hook. Because yes, some part of Thalisse believed Gryfen wanted to see her. Not as a spectacle, as a person. The thought rose uninvited. What if I did? What if I lifted it just once, just for him, in private, where the world couldn't laugh? The whisper softened, almost kind. Just once. Thalisse's fingers twitched toward the veil. Gryffin's hand caught her wrist, warm, steady, not tight enough to hurt, firm enough to anchor. "Thalisse," he said quietly. Not a command, a reminder. Her name, spoken like a rope thrown to someone in deep water. Thalisse's breath shook. "It's in my head. It's in the air," Gryfen corrected, voice low. "And it lies." Yennefer's mouth twisted. "I hate it. It's manipulative. It's basically a charming stranger at a party." The whisper sharpened. Annoyed now. "Take it off." Thalisse's heart raced. The urge pressed again, heavier, less sweet. Gryfen stepped closer, gaze locked on her eyes. "Not the veil. Listen to me," he murmured. "You do not have to prove anything. Not to them. Not to it." Thalisse's throat tightened. "But what if—" Gryffin's voice turned fierce, still quiet. "No." The single word cut through the pull like a blade through thread. Thalisse blinked hard. The whisper faltered. Yennefer leaned in slightly, voice dripping with contempt for the unseen. "She said no," Yennefer added, as if speaking to a rude guest. "And if you're having trouble understanding consent, that's not her problem. That's a you problem." For one breath, the room went very still. Then the candlelight on the metal pitcher trembled and slid away, as if something had withdrawn into shadow, frustrated. Thalisse sagged slightly, breath catching. Gryfen didn't release her wrist immediately. He waited until her pulse slowed, until her fingers stopped twitching toward the veil. Then softly he said, "I promised you." Thalisse swallowed. What promise? His gaze held hers, steady as stone, that I would protect you, even from what follows me. Yennefer cleared her throat loudly, as if sincerity needed to be interrupted before it became a health risk. "All right," she announced. "I'm calling it. Tonight's entertainment has been sufficient. Everyone go to sleep. Nobody talk to reflective objects, and if a spoon looks at you funny, throw it out." Thalisse almost laughed, but the sound didn't make it out, because the fire in the hearth gave a small crack, not the sound of wood settling, the sound of something pleased. And in the corner of Thalisse's vision, the covered mirror, far away, not in this room, but in her own chambers, seemed to exist in her mind like a closed eye that had just opened, waiting, learning new words, ready to try again tomorrow, when she was tired, alone, and missing warmth enough to mistake temptation for comfort. Thalisse inhaled through the veil's cool touch and realized with sudden clarity, the curse didn't want her face because it was curious. It wanted her face because it was afraid of what would happen when the world finally saw her, and still couldn't make her small. Thalisse had always measured nights by the veil, not by moons or candles or the distant bells of the keep, but by that single constant sensation, the cool touch of enchanted fabric at her mouth, the faint pressure over her cheeks, the way the world felt slightly muffled, as if sound itself had to pass through a rule before it reached her. Tonight, the veil felt different. It lay across her lap like a creature that had finished its long vigil and was waiting to be released from duty. The room around her was quiet in the careful way of royal rooms. Thick stone, heavy drapes, a fire kept low so it wouldn't flare too bright. Every reflective surface had been banished weeks ago, but the covered mirror still stood in the corner, draped in dark cloth like a condemned altar. Thalisse sat at the edge of her bed and ran 2 fingers along the veil's hem. Tomorrow, it would fall. Tomorrow, she would be seen. A laugh, small, disbelieving, threatened her throat. Not because the idea was funny, but because it felt impossible. She had lived her entire life inside an instruction. Hide. Don't look. Don't let anyone look too closely. A life made of corridors taken at odd hours, meals eaten behind fabric, voices that softened into pity or sharpened into cruelty. And then Gryfen Coldwyn had looked at her covered face and, without seeing what was beneath, had treated her like she was a person. Not a rumor. Not a curse. A person. She lifted the veil and let it brush her mouth. The magic in it was old and clean, like rainwater running over stone. It had protected her. She couldn't deny that. It had kept the malediction from finding its path too directly into her mind when she was younger, and had still believed the lies Dravenmore had taught her about herself. But protection had a cost. Protection was also a prison with velvet walls. "Last night," she whispered, though no one else was there. "Just one more." The fire popped softly, and then the air changed. Not with cold, though a chill threaded her skin, but with that subtle wrongness she had learned to recognize long before she could name it. A pressure behind her eyes. A soft tightening inside her skull, as if invisible fingers were testing the seams of her thoughts. The curse had been patient for years. Tonight, it was hungry. A voice slid into her mind as smoothly as breath. "He only wants to see your face to check for defects." Thalisse's hand clenched around the veil, knuckles whitening. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It sounded like it came from her own certainty, wearing her own tone like a stolen cloak. "If you're ugly, he'll abandon you at the altar." Her stomach turned, sharp and immediate, like she'd swallowed a stone. "If you're beautiful, he'll only want you for it. Not for you." The worst part wasn't the cruelty. It was how well the curse chose its weapons. It didn't invent new fear. It simply pointed at the old ones and said, "Here, this. Remember this?" Thalisse's gaze flicked, despite herself, toward the covered mirror. Her breath hitched. "Get up. Look. See for yourself. Don't trust him. Don't trust anyone." The cloth over the mirror seemed suddenly too thin, too fragile. She could imagine the glass underneath like an open eye. She could imagine her own reflection waiting like a trap. Thalysse's legs shifted. Her body started to rise. The veil cooled. A familiar, steadying presence, as if it were trying to remind her of every moment it had saved her. Its magic pressed gently against her skin, a quiet command. Stay. But the curse pushed again, more insistent, more intimate. You have to know. You have to. Or tomorrow will kill you. Thalisse stood. One step, then another. Her hand reached toward the mirror without permission, fingers extending as if pulled by a thread. Her heart hammered in her ears. And then, through the thick silence of stone and velvet, she felt something else. Presence. Not inside her mind. Outside her door. The curse hissed like a snake disturbed. Thalisse froze, palm hovering in the air. On the other side of the door, someone exhaled. The sound was quiet, controlled, and unmistakably real. Gryfen. He didn't speak. He didn't knock. He didn't barge in as if her fear belonged to him to command. He simply sat. She could hear the faint shift of fabric against stone, the soft scrape of a boot, the careful stillness of a man placing his body between her and whatever he couldn't see. Talisse's throat tightened. The curse tried again, but now its voice had competition. The steady fact of him, waiting without demand. Her fingers curled, slowly withdrawing from the mirror as if she were pulling her hand out of deep water. She backed away from the corner, one controlled step at a time, until her shoulders met the door. She rested her forehead against the wood. On the other side, Gryfen spoke, voice low. "Thalisse." It wasn't a question. It was an anchor. "I'm here," she managed, though her voice shook. "I know." A pause. I felt something. Not the shadow. Not the way it usually is. This felt like knives. Thalisse swallowed. "It's in my head tonight." Silence on the other side. And then the faint sound of him shifting closer. Still not opening the door. "Talk to me. It says things." She hated the weakness in her voice. Hated how much of her still believed the curse was simply telling truths no one else dared to say aloud. "It says you want to make sure I'm not—" She couldn't finish. Gryfen's answer came fast, rawer than usual. "No." Thalisse laughed once, sharp. That was convincing. His breath caught. "I'm sorry. Not because you doubt me. Because you have reason to doubt the world." The words landed gently, like a blanket placed over trembling shoulders. They stayed like that, separated by wood, for a long moment. Thalisse could feel the warmth of his presence through the door, as if the stone corridor itself had learned to hold heat where he sat. "I never told you," Gryfen said, and his voice shifted into something she recognized, the tone of a man stepping onto ground he'd avoided for years. "Why I flinch from reflections, why I never look." Talisse's fingers pressed to the wood. "You don't have to." "I do." Another pause. "Because tomorrow, you'll be asked to choose, openly, and I can't let you do that without knowing what you're binding yourself to." Thalisse held her breath. "When I was young," Gryfen said, "I had someone I loved who didn't listen." Her mind offered images, brother, father, but Gryfen didn't name the person, and somehow that made it worse. It let the grief be larger than a single face. "They thought it was superstition," he continued, voice threading with strain. "A Coldwin fear. A story to frighten heirs into obedience. They found an old mirror in a sealed wing of the keep, polished silver backed with glass. Too perfect, too clean. They laughed. They leaned close. They stared." Talisse's skin prickled. "And then," Gryfen whispered, the mirror stared back. A chill moved through her bones. "They didn't die," he said, as if he had to clarify it for himself. "That would have been simpler. They just emptied, like a lantern with its flame pinched out. Their eyes still moved, their mouth still spoke. But the person I loved, gone." Talisse's eyes burned. "I'm sorry. I learned fear that day," Gryfen said. Not fear of dying. Fear of losing yourself while your body keeps walking. Fear of becoming a shell that smiles on command. He exhaled slowly, and she heard the faint tremor he tried to hide. So, I made a vow. I would never look. I would never give it a path through me. Thalysse's palm flattened against the door, as if she could press comfort through grain and iron hinges. I can't come in, Gryfen said softly. Not tonight. I won't steal your solitude, but I can sit here until morning if you want. Thalisse swallowed hard. Why? Because you sat alone with this for too long. The curse tried to speak again. He's performing. He wants you indebted. But its voice was thinner now, fraying at the edges, drowned by the simple stubbornness of Gryfen's presence. Thalisse lifted her other hand and placed it on the door, just above her first. On the other side, Gryfen's hand landed in the same place. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. The warmth seeped through the wood like truth. Thalisse closed her eyes. It wants me to look. I know, Gryfen murmured. It says I'll regret it if I don't. You might regret many things tomorrow, Gryfen said, but if you regret anything, let it be that you chose with open eyes, not with fear. Thalisse's throat tightened. It's hard to know what I am without the veil. I think, Gryfen said slowly, you've always known. You just weren't allowed to say it out loud. Footsteps approached down the corridor with the unmistakable rhythm of someone who refused to creep, as if stealth were an insult. Yennefer. She stopped short, and her voice arrived like a thrown dagger wrapped in silk. If you two are going to do a romantic vigil, you could at least warn me so I bring snacks. Thalisse startled into a wet laugh she hadn't expected to have in her body tonight. Gryfen sighed. Yennefer? What? Yennefer sounded offended by the very concept of tenderness. This is peak melodrama. King on the floor, veiled bride whispering through a door, curse in the walls. Someone is going to start composing ballads, and I will personally set the paper on fire. Thalisse pressed her hand harder into the wood, smiling through the sting behind her eyes. Yennefer's tone softened a fraction, which for her was practically a declaration of love. Thalisse, you awake? I am. Yennefer cleared her throat like she was trying to scrape vulnerability off her tongue. Good. Because I'm coming in. Before Thalisse could answer, Yennefer's voice dipped, quieter, angled toward Gryfen. Don't you dare move. If you break this moment by standing up like a normal person, I will trip you. Gryfen's reply was resigned. I won't move. Thalisse opened the door. Yennefer slipped inside and closed it behind her, leaving Gryfen in the corridor. She took one look at Thalisse's face, still veiled, but the trembling in her shoulders obvious, and clicked her tongue. All right, Yennefer said briskly, as if fear were a loose strap that simply needed tightening. Tell me where the curse is. I'm going to threaten it. Thalisse snorted. With what? Yennefer patted the knife at her hip. With cutlery. It's my love language. Then Yennefer's eyes, sharp, watchful, flicked to the covered mirror. The cloth moved. Thalisse whispered. Yennefer's mouth tightened. Of course it did. Thalisse sat on the bed again, exhausted in the deep way that came from fighting inside your own skull. Yennefer sat beside her, too close for comfort in the way only friends dared. I'm supposed to say something inspiring, Yennefer muttered, staring at the floor like it had insulted her. Something like, you're brave, or you're ready, or your face doesn't define you. Thalisse's breath caught. Those are good, Yennefer grimaced. Don't encourage me. I'll start developing emotions and then where will we be? Probably hugging, horrifying. Thalisse turned her veiled face toward her. Yennefer stared at the wall. I've never had a real friend. The words fell into the room like a dropped cup, quiet, but impossible to ignore. I've had allies, Yennefer continued, voice tight. People who laughed at my jokes. People who liked me when I was useful. But you're the first person who looked at me. Really looked. And didn't ask me to soften. Thalisse's chest ached. You're the first person who made me laugh in years. Yennefer blinked fast, irritated at her own eyes. Yes, well, I'm infuriatingly charming. Thalisse reached out, and for a second hesitated. Touch still felt like a luxury she hadn't earned. Then she laid her hand over Yennefer's on the bedspread. Yennefer didn't pull away. They sat like that, hand over hand, two women who had both survived by being sharp. One behind fabric, one behind sarcasm. Yennefer finally cleared her throat. So, tomorrow, you're going to lift the veil. Yes. And you're going to do it because you choose to. Yes. And if the curse whispers in your head again, you're going to imagine me threatening it with a fork. Thalisse laughed, small and real. I will. Yennefer nodded once. Brisk. Good. The fire popped again, louder this time. Thalisse's gaze drifted to the mirror. The cloth over it moved. Just a ripple, like something underneath had exhaled. It didn't fall. It didn't reveal glass. But it moved enough to promise, I am still here. Yennefer followed her gaze and stood, placing herself between Thalisse and the corner. Let it wait, she said, voice like steel. Tomorrow it learns what happens when it tries to own someone who's done being ashamed. Thalisse's throat tightened. Across the door, Gryffin's presence remained, steady as stone. She didn't speak her decision aloud. She didn't need to. It sat in her chest like a seed that had finally split open. Tomorrow, she would be seen. And she would not flinch. Morning arrived without drama. No thunder. No shrieking omens. Just pale light seeping through heavy curtains, turning the stone walls the color of ash and pearl. For a moment, Thalisse lay still and listened to her own breathing, waiting for the curse to pounce the instant she opened her eyes. It didn't. Not yet. The veil was still there, resting beside her pillow. She lifted it and pressed it to her mouth out of habit. Cool, familiar, protective. Thank you, she whispered, because gratitude felt like the only proper goodbye. The covered mirror stood in the corner, perfectly still, the cloth hanging straight like a judge's robe. It looked harmless. That was how traps always looked, right before they snapped. Thalisse rose and washed in a basin that had been placed with deliberate care. No polished silver, no gleaming surfaces, no reflective water left uncovered. The keep had learned its rules well. The keep had learned fear. A knock came at the door. Yennefer didn't wait for permission. She entered carrying a tray of breakfast and the expression of someone about to face a battlefield. Eat, she ordered, as if hunger were an enemy she could stab. I'm not sure I can, Thalisse admitted. Yennefer set the tray down with more force than necessary. Then chew out of spite. Spite is an excellent nutrient. Thalisse smiled, and that alone felt like progress. Yennefer hovered awkwardly, then gestured at Thalisse's hair as if it had offended her personally. Sit, I'm going to do this. Thalisse lowered herself onto a chair. Yennefer took a brush from the dressing table, wood, not polished metal, and stood behind her. For a moment, her hands hovered uncertainly, like she'd never been taught how to touch someone gently. Then the first stroke came. Slow, careful, intimate in a way Thalisse had never experienced. Not because hair was sacred, but because it was proof of care offered without transaction. Yennefer brushed again, more confident, untangling strands with patient precision. Thalisse swallowed around a sudden ache. I've never prepared like this. Not for anything. Yennefer's voice was quieter than usual. You didn't have mirrors. You didn't have permission. You didn't have anyone who cared. Thalisse's fingers tightened on the chair arms. What if I'm disappointed? Yennefer snorted softly. In your face? In everything, Thalisse whispered. In what it means. In what they did to me. Yennefer's brush paused, then resumed. Listen to me. You don't need a mirror to know who you are. You already know. You always knew. Thalisse closed her eyes. For a moment, the curse tried to hiss. You're lying to yourself. But Yennefer's words held more weight than venom. Thalisse stood and let Yennefer help her into the wedding garments. The dress was beautiful, but simple. Fabric that moved like water. Embroidery that didn't try to compensate for myth. It felt like a choice rather than a costume. No mirrors were allowed in the room. Thalisse dressed without seeing herself. And for the first time in her life, that fact didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like freedom. When the time came, Yennefer offered her arm. Ready? Thalisse exhaled. No. Yennefer nodded. Perfect. Let's do it anyway. They stepped into the corridor. The keep was lined with people, servants pressed to the walls, courtiers standing in uneasy stillness, guards in ceremonial formation. Months ago, the air would have been full of whispers and cruel curiosity. Today, the silence felt like respect, or fear, or both. Thalisse walked forward, veil in place, her steps measured. She saw Selwyn near the front, posture straight, face composed. His eyes met hers and he gave a small nod. No flourish, no performance, just acknowledgement. Further back, she glimpsed faces she recognized not as courtiers, but as people she had helped while wearing ash-colored gloves and moving through the world as the Ashen Magus. A child whose fever she'd broken. A cook whose hands she'd healed after a burn. A stable boy she'd steadied after panic. They didn't know it was her, but something in their expressions softened as she passed, as if some part of them recognized kindness, even when it wore a veil. The doors to the ceremony hall opened, light spilled out, and there he was. Gryfen waited at the altar in dark formal cloth, silver thread at his cuffs, his posture rigid with effort. He looked like a man trying to hold an entire kingdom's history steady with his bare hands. When Thalisse approached, his eyes fixed on her with such open emotion that her breath caught. He hadn't seen her face, and still he looked at her like she was precious. The officiant spoke, voice trembling, words ancient and careful, phrases that had been used for centuries, stripped of meaning by repetition. Then Gryfen lifted a hand, not touching her, but hovering near the veil as if asking permission with his entire body. His voice came out steady, but gentle. "Do you lift the veil by your own will?" Thalisse's mouth went dry. This was the hinge of everything. She heard the curse in the back of her mind, stirring, gathering itself like a storm behind glass. She heard Dravenmore's lies. She heard her own fear. And then she heard something else. Gryfen's confession through the door last night. Yennefer's brush in her hair. The warmth of a hand through wood. Thalisse breathed in. "I choose," she said, and she lifted the veil. The fabric slid up, cool against her cheeks, then away. Air touched her lips without magic between them. Light hit her skin as if the world had been waiting decades for this simple, ordinary thing. The hall held its breath. Thalisse looked forward, unable to see herself, only able to see everyone else seeing her. And then she understood the cruel joke of it. Her face was normal, not breathtaking, not monstrous, just a face. Sawdust scattered across her cheeks like spilled dust, a nose slightly crooked from a childhood fall. Eyes gray, unremarkable in color but clear in gaze. A small scar on her chin that looked more like an accident than a story. A human face, a common face. The kind of face that could belong to any woman in any village. The court's shock shifted. Not into disgust, not into awe, but into something colder. Realization. They had hidden her because there had been nothing to hide. They had inherited an ancient tradition. The veil. The law of the invisible bride, without understanding its purpose. And instead of admitting ignorance, they had filled the empty space with cruelty. They had invented shame. They had claimed Dravenmore daughters were wrong, so no one would ask why the veil existed at all. They had sent her sisters away, tucked into convents, erased from story because a lie required maintenance. And Thalisse, the youngest, the most controllable, had been kept as proof of a myth that never had teeth until they gave it fangs. Thalisse stood in the silence, face bare, and felt something break inside her. Not her dignity, not her spirit, but the last thread tying her to the idea that their judgment meant anything. She was not a defect. She was evidence. Gryfen stared at her for a long moment. The room waited for him to say something easy. Something like beautiful. Something like it doesn't matter. He didn't. His voice was steady and warm. "You are exactly who I expected." Thalisse's eyes stung, because she understood what he meant. He hadn't expected a face. He had expected her. The woman who carried herself like silence could be strength. The woman who chose to help when no one watched. The woman who had been whole inside a veil. Thalisse finally let herself cry, her face bare to the world for the first time. That was when the curse struck. Not as a whisper, as a chorus. The hall's reflective surfaces, silver goblets, polished belt buckles, gemstone settings, the sheen of lacquered wood, flared with cold light. Even eyes seemed to catch it, turning briefly into small mirrors. The air thickened, heavy as wet wool. The voice came from everywhere at once, not one mouth but 1,000 reflections singing the same cruelty. Now I see you. Now I have you. Now you are mine. Panic rippled through the crowd. Someone gasped. Someone prayed. Someone dropped a cup and the sound rang too bright, too sharp. Yennefer in the first row drew her knife with grim delight. Finally, she muttered. Something I can threaten. Selwyn moved with swift control, ushering servants backward, placing bodies out of line of gleam. Down, he ordered softly. Eyes lowered, hands steady. Gryfen stepped in front of Thalisse, shoulders squared, as if his body could block a thing made of light. But Thalisse moved. She stepped around him. Gryfen followed close behind, ready to support her. Thalisse faced the shining reflections and listened. The curse's voice was loud, and yet beneath it, she sensed something else. Weakness, not in its volume, but in its grip. It could see her now, yes. She was unveiled, exposed, visible, but it couldn't hook into her the way it wanted. Thalisse understood with sudden clarity. The curse fed on shame, on fear, on isolation. It had grown fat on the lie that her face was wrong, on the loneliness of being hidden, on the belief that she was safest when she was unseen. But now, she wasn't ashamed. She stood barefaced in front of the entire court and felt no urge to fold in on herself. She was seen, and she was still whole. She had been whole even before this, when she walked at night as the Ashen Magus, helping others without applause. The veil hadn't made her. The veil had only covered what already existed. The curse hissed through the reflections, furious, trying to find a crack. Thalisse lifted her chin. Her voice rang clear across the hall. "You can't hurt me anymore." The reflections flared brighter. Thalisse didn't flinch. "You never could," she said, and her words tasted like freedom. "I just didn't know." The pressure in the air wavered, as if the curse had been struck in the chest. Gryfen turned slowly, eyes fixing on the shining surfaces like a man facing the thing that had shaped his entire life. His jaw tightened, and for the first time Thalisse saw not the king, but the boy who had watched someone he loved become empty. "You will not use me again," Gryfen said. The curse's chorus shifted, sharpening, hunting for his fear like a scent. Gryfen's voice didn't break. "I'll tell them," he said, and something in his tone was both confession and execution. "I'll tell her." He looked at Thalisse. "What I've hidden." Thalisse's heart clenched. Gryfen spoke to the hall, but his words were for her too. This curse isn't a random cruelty of fate. It is an inheritance. A cold ripple moved through the crowd. "Centuries ago," Gryfen continued, "a Coldwyn ancestor made a pact with the creature in the reflections. Not to gain power, not for vanity, to keep the realm from collapsing under a calamity that would have swallowed everything we knew." The reflections pulsed, as if the curse hated being named. "The price," Gryfen said, "was that the malediction would bind to our bloodline. Father to child, feeding on fear and self-loathing. It waits in mirrors because mirrors are where people go to judge themselves." He swallowed hard. "It has always used us." Thalisse stepped closer. Gryfen's eyes met hers. "I discovered the old law in the archive, the law of the invisible bride, not as tradition, as counterspell, as a completion. If a bride, veiled by old magic, chooses to be seen, fully, willingly, then the pact has no shame left to hold on to. The curse loses its anchor." The hall trembled with reflected light. Thalisse understood. It needed someone who was already whole. Gryfen's breath shook. "Yes." Thalisse lifted her gaze to the shining goblets, the glittering jewels, the cold glare trying to pull her back into fear. Then she turned to Gryfen and saw him. Not just his face, but his dread, his inherited burden, his years of restraint, his devotion that had never demanded reward. "I see you, I understand you now," Thalisse said, voice soft but unbreakable. "All of you." The curse screamed. Not a sound, but a pressure that stabbed into every mind present. Rage made of light. Thalisse held Gryffin's gaze. "And I choose you anyway." Something shifted. The reflections flickered. The cold light wavered like a flame starved of air. And then the curse began to unravel. Not in a grand explosion, not in a spectacle of heroics, but in a slow, inevitable erasure. Like ink lifted from cloth. Like fog thinning under sunlight. The chorus faltered. The pressure eased. The silver goblets became just goblets again. The jewels lost their cold gleam and returned to ordinary sparkle. The air lightened. Gryfen swayed. Thalisse caught him, hands firm, feet steady. For a moment they simply breathed. Thalisse looked down at the floor. Gryfen's shadow lay behind him. Still, not twisting, not reaching, just a shadow. Gryfen stared too, as if he'd been waiting his whole life for that ordinary proof. He let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "It's gone." Talisse's throat burned. "Yes." The officiant, pale as parchment, cleared his throat with trembling hands. If we may continue?" Gryfen straightened with effort. He looked at Thalisse, and something in his expression was not duty but choice. "I accept," Gryfen said first. "And I choose." Thalisse lifted her chin, veil gone, face bare, heart steady. "I accept," she answered. "And I choose." They spoke vows they had written together. No empty tradition, no borrowed words meant to impress gods that had never bothered to show up. Promises shaped by nights of honesty, by fear named aloud, by laughter shared through doors. Yennefer in the front row dabbed her eyes aggressively with her sleeve. "Allergies," she announced to no one. "Extremely violent allergies." When the ceremony ended, the hall exhaled as one body, and celebration came not as roaring triumph, but as stunned relief. At the banquet, the music was gentler than expected. The laughter sounded slightly shaky, like people relearning joy after holding their breath too long. The woman with pale hair, the one from that cruel dinner long ago, approached Thalisse with hesitant steps. Her hands twisted in front of her as if she were trying to wring out the past. "My queen," she said, voice low. "I asked you something unforgivable about eating, about the veil. I didn't think. I'm sorry." Thalisse looked at her for a long moment. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not a performance. It wasn't something you offered to make others comfortable. "I accept your apology," Thalisse said calmly, "and I will not pretend it didn't hurt." The woman flinched, then nodded, relief and shame mingling honestly on her face. "Thank you," she whispered, and retreated. Selwyn rose for a toast, brief, elegant. "To the courage of being seen," he said, and the hall echoed the words softly, as if testing them for truth. Then Yennefer stood. The room braced. Yennefer raised her goblet with the authority of someone who could start a riot accidentally. "To our queen," she said, "who survived all of you. To our king, who finally learned that shadows belong on floors, not in minds. And to anyone who thinks they can make a joke about veils or curses or my friends." She patted the knife at her hip. "I'd like to introduce you to my philosophy on cutlery." Laughter broke out, loud and real. Even Thalisse laughed, head tipping back, unafraid. Later, after the last guest had stumbled away, after the keep had quieted into exhausted peace, Thalisse and Gryfen finally found solitude. No guards, no courtiers, no old laws hanging like chains. Just them. Thalisse stood by the window, looking out at the dim gardens. Her face felt strange without the veil, as if her skin had forgotten how to be touched by air. Gryfen approached slowly, as if he was still learning what freedom allowed. Thalisse turned. They looked at each other for a long time. Then Thalisse gently touched his face. Warm, real. The shadow didn't move. Skin, warmth. No recoil from shadow. No tightening of air. Gryfen reached up, gently touching her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Thalisse closed her eyes. What happens now? Gryffin's mouth curved into a smile that looked like it had been waiting years to exist. Now we live. And the kingdom? It will learn to follow us, he said, not fear us. Thalisse's breath hitched. And the Ashen Magus? Gryfen's smile deepened, real and whole. The Ashen Magus can rest, he said softly. Or he can teach me. I'd like to learn how to help without needing to be haunted first. Thalisse smiled, and then she embraced him warmly, their foreheads touching as they shared a quiet moment of peace. No curse, no veil, just choice. 6 months later, the sun over Coldwyn's gardens was weak but kind, the sort of light that warmed skin without demanding anything dramatic. Thalisse stood by the back gate with a basket of bread and small vials of remedies, her sleeves rolled slightly, hair pinned back in a practical way Yennefer insisted was criminally sensible for a queen. Children approached in hesitant clusters, thin, curious, half wild with the instinct to distrust castles. Thalisse knelt to be level with them. A little boy took bread with both hands, staring at her face like it was a story he didn't fully believe. Are you the queen? Thalisse smiled. The act still felt new, like a language her muscles were learning. I am. And you give bread to us? I do. Why? Thalisse paused, because answers mattered. Because no one should be hungry, she said, voice gentle. And because someone once taught me that helping others is the only thing no one can take from you. Behind her, Gryfen stood with another basket, sleeves rolled too, shoulders relaxed in a way he'd never managed before. He looked less like a monument and more like a man. His shadow lay behind him, faithful and still. Yennefer reclined on a bench nearby, pretending she wasn't watching with pride. If anyone cries, she announced lazily, I'll deny it and start insulting the weather. A child ran forward suddenly and hugged Thalisse around the neck. Thalisse stiffened for a heartbeat, old reflex, then softened and hugged back, face lifting into the sunlight. Gryfen watched her with bright eyes. When the baskets were empty, Thalisse and Gryfen walked back toward the keep together, side by side. The path was stone. The air smelled like earth and late herbs. Somewhere behind them, Yennefer complained about the cold, as if winter were a personal enemy. Thalisse glanced down. 2 shadows stretched alongside them. Just shadows. She stopped at the edge of the garden and looked back at the gate, at the place where fear used to live. Gryfen squeezed her hand. Thalisse smiled, wide, unhidden, needing no permission. Let's go home, she said. And they did. The end. Dear reader, so what did you think of the ending? If you've watched this far, comment, "The veil has fallen." That's our code. I'll be reading and responding to you all. See you in the next video. With love, Maggie Reed.